Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical is the title of one of Dan Henderson's books, and he talked about many of his books that he's written and is currently writing at the Washington Author Fest at the Washington Public Library on Saturday, November 4th, 2023. I was there as well as a lot of other authors, and we're going to share with you Dan's presentation, and then we're going to follow up that presentation with me asking Dan a few questions. This is all brought to you by Car Doctor of Washington, Iowa. No matter who Frankensteined it, they can fix and clean and customize it. Griner Auto Body of Washington, Iowa, using state-of-the-art techniques and decades of experience to get your car back on the road after an accident. McDonald Boneyard of Keota, Iowa, for all of your farm equipment and auto recycling needs. Hinshaw Trailer Sales of Richland, Iowa. You need a trailer? They've got your trailer, and they fix what they sell and don't in their full-time repair shop. Girling Repair of Winfield, Iowa. If your mower is dead, call Fred, your Husqvarna, Aaron's, and Gravely dealer, and he also fixes snow blowers. B&B Propane and the family of Jet Stops present Southeast Iowa Today. I'm John Bain, author of Christie's Journey, The Beat Goes On, and your host. Let's get right to it.
AuthorFest 2023. Thank you all for coming. The Washington Public Library is so pleased to be hosting a diverse group of Iowa authors for our second year of AuthorFest. We hope you will spend all or part of your day with us today as our readers or as our authors read from their works. We also want to mention that our authors will be available in the author room, which is the Washington State Bank room, throughout the day. Their books will be available for purchase and signing, including local authors Mike Cramey, Sharon A. Rowe, John Main, and Corrine Stanley, who agreed to be part of this event. Please take time to visit with them. Also, please take a moment to silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already. Our first author today is a friend of the library who has done a variety of programs for us over the years and answered the call when we needed someone to open today's readings. Dan Henderson has had a 40-year career in education and a passion for history and historic sites and traveling. He has published Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical, a Henderson history, and is currently working on a new book. Please welcome Dan Henderson.
All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Glad to see those that are here today. I'm going to tell you about the two books that she mentioned that were published last year, and I'll do a reading from one of them. And then I'm going to share with you the two books. There's actually two books that are going to be coming out next year in 2024. I'll tell you a little bit about those projects. So the first one that you may not have heard as much about is this one called A Henderson History. It's a tall tree with deep roots. Now it's about my family, but my family's history is documented all the way back to the early 1700s in New Jersey colony. And this book, you don't have to be a Henderson to enjoy it. If you like Little House on the Prairie, you will like this book because it's about Hendersons that came across the Midwest. They were pioneers in Illinois in 1819. They were pioneers in Iowa in the early 1850s. Their memoirs, their stories, it's a fun book. It really is. So if you want to know what life was like on an Iowa farm during the Great Depression, this book will give you a first-hand view of what that was like. My aunts and my grandmother and people write about that. It was a horrible period of time, as we all know. The second one is this one that you may know about, Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical. And this book is very much a personal memoir of my own spiritual journey. I'm going to do a quick reading, hopefully quick, from this book. I read from it last year. Now, what I'm going to read to you is a true story of me when I was in old junior high, early high school years. And I was involved in a church youth group. And we had, it was a big youth group in Council Bluffs, Iowa is where I grew up. So I want to kind of give you a disclaimer on this. These are my views. They don't represent the library. They don't represent anyone else. except me, and it's not meant to disparage anyone's religious beliefs, but it will be maybe a little bit controversial, okay? So kind of give you a teaser on that. So let me just get started. In telling this story, I am not proud of the behavior and attitudes that I exhibited, but I think it is still relevant to share in light of how gays are being treated today. For some unknown reason, kids and many adults still feel they have a green light to bully and discriminate against gay people. And we see the results that many times are devastating or even deadly. It is no coincidence that young gays are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than their straight counterparts. My story doesn't include a suicide, at least I don't think, but the disapproval that I and others heaped upon one young man in our church youth group was enough to cause hurt and damage that certainly made his life more difficult, especially coming from the hands of those who proclaim Christ as their personal Savior. I want to tell you about a young man named Murph. His last name was Murphy, and I honestly am not sure of his first name because we just called him Murph. Murph was an outwardly gay individual who joined our youth group in the 1960s. Tells you how old I am, right? We had youth meetings that had many hot topics for discussion in those days. In the late 60s and early 70s, the topics were lively. We talked about civil rights, the Vietnam War, cultural phenomenon like the hippie movement, sex, drugs, and of course, rock and roll. But gay lifestyles never came up in these discussions because, as I remember, it was a taboo subject. We could talk about sex before marriage or living together versus marriage, but gay relationships, not on the radar. Now, Murph came to these meetings and shared his views and opinions just like the rest of us, but somehow during the discussions we ended up usually dismissing his ideas. I think we didn't give Murph the credibility he deserved because, Murph was gay. He was never included in many of our social events that we organized outside the youth group. We were secretly and quietly embarrassed by Murph because of his effeminate manner. I'm not sure to what degree he knew that he was a second-class member of our group, but as time went on, it seemed that it became more and more acceptable to exclude and to even make fun of Murph for his mannerisms and his orientation, and we did. Why Murph continued to come to our youth group, I'm not sure. We certainly were not showing him God's love in any meaningful way. Eventually, someone tried to talk to him to literally straighten him out, but Murph simply dismissed their reprimands and continued to be himself and to be gay. Now, although my behavior was my decision and mine alone, the evangelical environment that I was in made it easy to condemn and be arrogant. How this saddens me today to think of how unloving I was toward another human being in the name of false righteousness. We were playing behavior police, proudly handing out behavior citations for God with clobber Bible verses written all over them. Now, the final straw for Murph came at a youth retreat. Our group held one every year. This was the usual spiritual retreat designed to get everyone to fall under the conviction of the Holy Spirit, and mainly through guilt and shame. And everyone would then throw themselves on the mercy of God. But this retreat had a fun side to it. There was a talent show one night, which was a bit of an open mic, silly sketch event where everyone did something absurd, and the more absurd, the better. Everyone laughed and had a good time. When Murph's time or moment came, he walked out on the platform in drag, doing an imitation of Mae West. And as I remember, it was a very good one. For anyone younger than 40 years old, you may want to Google Mae West. She was the movie star diva of the 1920s and 30s, and her persona included a raw sexuality that was quite scandalous for her time. Murph's depiction of her was over the top, but it was funny in hindsight. Now, unfortunately, several leaders in the youth group didn't see the humor so much and decided they needed to confront Murph about his obvious gay proclivities. Being part of the leadership by that time, I was part of the Bible lynch mob that cornered Murph that night. There were 3 or 4 of us that were pounding him with clobber verses from the Bible about what a horrible sin it is to be gay. Although I don't think this was motivated by hate or was meant to be harassment, the result was the same. I don't think anyone stopped long enough to consider his feelings or the impact of our hurtful words. The assumption on our part was Murph had simply chosen his orientation and that he could just as easily unchoose it somehow. I can only imagine the loneliness and alienation that Murph must have felt that night, and we felt all so smugly self-righteous and arrogant about it. Now, it wasn't long after that retreat, Murph stopped coming to our group. He may have come once or twice more, but then he dropped off the map completely, and I know he didn't feel welcome any longer. And instead of showing any concern to reach out to him, we felt relieved that we didn't have to deal with the Murph problem anymore. Now, Murph did contact us several months later and invited some of us to come to his new church one Friday night. They had their own coffee house. Remember coffee houses in the 60s, yeah, if you're old enough. They had their own coffee house on Friday nights. He wanted to show it off. A couple of us went over there, and shock of shocks, we had walked into a gay coffee house. Apparently, this church openly accepted gays and provided a safe place for them to socialize. I remember the sense of uneasiness and disconcerting feeling of being in the minority for once. It was a shock to my evangelical brain that there were people that called themselves Christian but were actively and openly gay. Of course, we felt we had to fix these people, so we got into a heated theological debate with some of the leaders of the coffee house. Out came the clobber verses. Then I heard for the first time an actual reasonable refutation of these verses. At the time, I thought these folks were just deluded. But I think that conversation planted a seed of doubt within me that over the course of several decades, because I'm a slow learner, would come to full bloom. We left the coffee house after the discussion, and I never saw Murph again. I don't know what became of him, but it seems he had found a home. I sincerely hope that he found the love, acceptance, and the support that we did not provide to him. Looking back on this experience, I know and understand now this was a classic case of putting dogma before people and the worship of a literal Bible ahead of loving others. I've come to see myself and the other group leaders in the role of Pharisees, who Jesus roundly condemns over and over. I can only say that looking at it today, I wish there were do-overs. But the one thing I can do now is advocate and work toward a more enlightened sense of what the teachings of Jesus are on this subject, and just about every other subject on which I had to unlearn a literal biblical dogma. So Murph, if you are out there, I do hope you have found the love of your life. I hope that you found acceptance and support from Christians that are far more enlightened than me and my group. I can only ask that you forgive me for my ignorance and misplaced priorities, for making you feel like a second-class human being and somehow less deserving of God's love than straight people. And if you decide to get married to your partner, I would be willing to buy a cake for you. Or better yet, let me bake one for you. So next year, I'll have 2 books coming out. One of them I'll tell you about. And by the way, both of these you can pre-order from my table. I've got a sheet of paper. You don't have to pay anything now. But if you want to be kept up on when they're coming out and how it's progressing, you can sign up and put an email address on there. First one is called, it kind of grew out of this book. It's called A Spiritual Journey to Anti-Racism, a Travel Guide for White People. And so it's my view or my experience, I guess, of moving from being a comfortable non-racist. You ask almost every white person around, they all tell you, well, I'm not a racist. but they're not anti-racist. And there's a big difference between the two things. So the book is about how do we get from just kind of being comfortable with our whiteness and what's going on around us to becoming anti-racist, where we actually work to tear down systems of discrimination that exist. That's one book. Now the other one is actually quite different. I'm going to read from this one. This, in 2015, I received an inheritance of a scrapbook from my aunt. And it was the story, and I knew about this story before, but I had never really spent much time with it. It was the story of two granduncles of mine who grew up in Clarinda, Iowa, if you know where Clarinda is, in the southwest corner. Their father, who would be my great-grandfather, opened coal mining operations in Clarinda in the 1870s. And that lasted till the 1960s. They shut it down finally. But at any rate, these two men, young men, decided they didn't want to be coal miners. And they wanted to go into show business. They became famous vaudeville performers. So the name of this book is going to be From the Iowa Coal Mines to the Palace Theater, the vaudeville career of the Pearson brothers. And it's an amazing story. I've done a couple presentations, one here at the library, but as I dig more and more, I keep finding out more and more about these guys. It's a fun story. So I'm going to read for you from a little bit from chapter 4 about how they got out of the coal mines. How many of you knew coal mining was in Iowa? Yeah, some do. So here it is. Coal miners could make a good living if they didn't mind hard work, mine shafts, dangerous conditions, and likely dying at a young age. The Pearsons paid between $30 to $50 a week, depending on how much a miner could individually produce. It was in these mines that Carl Pearson found work from the time he was a teenager. He never attended high school. Until one day, Earl came home from losing his position with the Deming Theater Company because his partner, Shorty McCord, had taken off with the leading lady. He suddenly appeared at the mine to find his younger brother, Carl. He was determined to get Carl to become a new dance partner with him. Here's how this may have happened. Based on the documentation we do have, the following is a supposed conversation. It's not word for word. Supposed conversation based on the interview evidence. Knowing the mines well, Earl descended into one of the shafts to find his kid brother, Carl. Earl carefully winds his way through the various mining corridors until he finds Carl working away filling a cart with coal. He is sweaty, dirty, and wearing a hard hat. Carl was well suited to working in the mines, being shorter in stature than his older brother. Carl would probably have stayed in the mining industry had it not been for this fateful day in 1915. Carl, I just got back from a tour with the Deming Theater Company, and Shorty married the leading lady and they took off. So I'm without a dance partner, Earl says to his younger brother. Sorry to hear that, Earl. I knew Shorty was pretty unreliable, Carl retorts as he continues to work. Well, I've come back home to get you out of these mines, little brother. I need a new dance partner, and I want you to come with me, Earl says insistently. Carl straightens up his head, still not touching the cavern ceiling. His look is of disbelief. Earl continues, you don't want to spend the rest of your life here in these mines, do you? Carl just as insistently barks back, Earl, there is no way, no. You know I can't dance, it ain't gonna happen. Carl, shaking his head, begins to turn back to his shovel, the dirty coal pile in front of him, and the back-breaking work ahead. Earl becomes more enthusiastic and says, Carl, what is the most you can make shoveling coal in these mines? $50 a week maybe? And how long will you be able to do that? You'll be bent over and washed up by the time you're 40. Earl is now setting up for his final plea. Carl, I know you can do this. I've seen you dance at the local school dances, and you are good. You've got some moves. But did you know that people in show business can make 3 or 4 times what you were making here in this coal mine? And if we become really good and become famous, we could probably make 10 times more. Carl, still shaking his head, looks up at his taller brother, who is bent over so his head won't hit the cavern ceiling. I don't know, Earl. I'm not very good at... Now, how long this conversation goes on, we don't know. But what is known is that Earl finally convinces his younger brother to join him. It was a pivotal moment in their lives where taking this risk had major consequences for the two of them. But what happens next, we do know. Earl and Carl, or Humpy and Tots, as they were known locally in Clarinda, found an old barn near Shenandoah, Iowa, to practice their dancing routines. There, among the hay bales and farm equipment, and probably with cows for an audience, the two boys worked up an acrobatic dance routine. The year was the fall of 1915, and they practiced their acrobatic dance moves in the barn. Now, how much more rural Iowa can you get? What the two boys couldn't foresee, but was only a dream at that point, was that by 1920, they would be performing at the famous Palace Vaudeville Theater in New York City. And the following year, they were performing for a president of the United States.
Wow.
So that's just a little bit to give you an idea of what that book is about. And so I have a couple of minutes left, so I don't know if you have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to know about, Carol?
The classic question, how do you make time to write? What's your,
Well, it's called being retired.
yeah.
And I retired a little over a year ago, and I had 2 books that came out last year
Yep.
that I'd already really worked on even while I was still working.
Aren't you still in school though, aren't you?
Well, actually, that's a good point. I was going to UNI in the public history program, and then my publisher said, "Can you get these 2 books out by the end of the year?"
Wow.
I said, "Well, I can if I don't go to school." So I told UNI I'm going to put that on hold for a year. And that's all, so all I've been doing 100% of my time is writing.
So you can work all day.
So I can work. So my goal, I was telling John, we were talking, and I said, my goal is I try to write 1,000 to 1,500 words a day. But not every day, because sometimes you're researching. I spend a lot of time researching, like on the Pearson story. There's a lot I have to uncover. But by and large, it's worked out pretty well. I closed the door. June doesn't bother me in there. She just as soon not. But I do get quite a bit done, so that's how it works. It is a discipline, though. You have to discipline yourself, because it's easy to get caught up with social media, and I watch the news, and oh yeah, I gotta get back to writing. Yeah.
What was the trigger in the gay cafe that kind of started your epiphany about evangelicalism?
Oh, yeah, this book was at Evolution. It goes back probably to about 2005, and at that point in time I was still working, still teaching, but I had sort of reached a point. I had been an evangelical for about 40 years by that point, or 30 maybe. Reached a point where I just had to question it all. I just began to question it. It just wasn't working out the way they said it was supposed to work. And so I began to question, and I began to journal about it, because that was, in those days, there really weren't a lot of people you could talk to about it. At least I didn't know any. And I had started writing about it. So over the course of about 10, 12 years, I kept writing. Pretty soon I started a blog. People seemed to appreciate it. And then I was encouraged to put it into a book form. So writing itself covers a long period of time. I didn't sit down to actually write a book like I have for these others. But it was a long process. Yeah.
Do you have any argument with yourself about the stories that you do tell, like telling yourself about murder, things that you should tell or should not tell? Is any process that you have, like I said, arguments within your being that you should tell the story or not tell this story?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, you're telling the story about Murph.
Right.
Do you feel that it infringes upon his world a little bit, telling more than you should tell, or maybe any arguments that you should maybe not tell this story, or maybe you should change or embellish it a little bit?
Yeah, when I sat down to write it, it was one of those points in time where You remember back to your earlier days, and because the name of the book is Confessions, I felt like, well, this story probably fits pretty well within that context of a confession. I did not behave well toward Murph, and my wish would be that I could find him again and make amends and apologize, even at this point in life. He's probably only a year or two older than I am, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's a pretty raw story in terms of just telling the truth. But I believe, being a historian, that's why we have to tell the truth about history. And people that are trying to hide the truth about history today are doing a great disservice to our young people and to our society in general. So in the name of honest history, I guess that's why I included that story. There's a couple others in there. I mean, it doesn't make me look really good. I mean, the way I grew up. But the good part is I rejected all that and have really, it isn't that I'm I might be anti-religious, but I'm not anti-spirituality. And so the place I've arrived is to say, I'm done with evangelicalism and belief systems like that, but I still think there's an awful lot about human beings that is so positive and good if we can connect to it. And that's where I'm at today. That's spirituality for me, connecting. So. Oh, yeah.
I was reading, it said you were a teacher for many years, and I wondered what subject you taught, and if it was easy for you to write, or is that something that just kind of comes naturally, or?
Yeah, I've always enjoyed writing. I taught history for 30 years, started in Omaha, Des Moines, my last job was here at Highland back in 2004. I still run into those students every once in a while. In fact, I was in Des Moines at a pizza place recently and ran into a student I hadn't seen in 30 years. And she was already becoming a grandmother, I think. Man. But anyway, the writing process, I loved writing. I even wrote, when I was in school, I wrote a poem in 8th grade. And my teacher liked it so well, she read it to the class, and I had never been harassed so badly by the other guys, with one of those, Henderson writing poetry. I said, well, I'm going out for football next year, just so you know. Yeah, anyway, so, but working full time makes it hard to be disciplined, so I knew when I retired a little over a year ago, that's what I wanted to do, is to really commit myself to writing. So far so good. We'll see how it goes. I got 1 minute left, right? Okay. Any others? Well, I want to thank you, especially the front row, because they can be a little rowdy. So. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Dan, welcome to Southeast Iowa today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey, really, it's my pleasure to have you on the podcast. And the audience has already learned a lot about the books you have written. And I'm just going to do some follow-up questions at this point in time.
Great.
What compelled you, once again, to write your books, and especially the one with Murph?
Well, that one about Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical has kind of been a long time coming. So I started writing about my own experience, partly as a way of thinking through different issues or beliefs that I had been raised with for many decades, and beginning to question and doubt those beliefs. And the one way that it helped me, one of the things I like to say is when I write down my thoughts, I'm able to look at it as an observer,
Right.
as an outside observer into my own thinking process, and either say, hey, that makes sense, or no, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
You can kind of evaluate it a little bit better, at least for me, when I can read my own thoughts. Well, that's kind of the origin of that whole book, because I was doing that for years and years as I was working my way out of an evangelical mindset. And by the time we get to around 2019, something like that, I was encouraged publish it. And so it came together. It wasn't written all at one time, like you normally would think of a book. But it began to fit together, and it began to fit together into categories. There were some natural categories. So in the book, you'll find a section on faith, a section on racism, a section on gay rights, a section on Christian nationalism. There's a whole bunch of different categories. And part of that is a reflection of my own background as a history teacher. I have keen interest in those kinds of historical and social issues. So they became part of the book too. But that's kind of how that came about.
Now, did you then leave the church?
Yes, I did. I had attended church my whole life. Originally I went forward at a Billy Graham crusade when I was like 9 years old or 10, 1960s. And from that point on, I attended church. I went to a Bible college. I taught in Christian schools for 20 years. Went to seminary for a while. And church and Christian faith was just part of who I was. But I had some events that occurred, that happened, that caused me to stop and think about what is it I really believe. And the key to the book is questioning and doubting. Question everything, doubt everything. And I discovered by doing that I sort of reformulated faith into something brand new that I hadn't thought of before.
So you're still a believer in God?
Well,
or not?
It depends on what you mean by God.
I guess. Okay. How about Jesus?
Jesus I'm great with Jesus.
Okay.
Because I think the teachings of Jesus, particularly when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, are just they're humanistic. And I know that's not a good word in a lot of Christian circles, but Jesus taught us how to be human.
Right.
By being peacemakers, merciful, meek, forgiving, love your enemies. All of those things that I think are still so relevant for what we need to hear. So I haven't thrown out Jesus, but there's so much. I have a friend, in fact, the guy that wrote the foreword to my book, Jim Palmer, he always says, Christianity is not the fault of Jesus. He didn't start the religion.
Right.
A lot of other people did that, and they added a lot of things to it that Jesus never even talked about.
So as a follower of Jesus, and Jesus taught, and you wrote this book, is there a way that somehow, is it just too big of an obstacle to say, hey, evangelical church that I was involved in, you need to change a little bit? Or is that something is that too big of a fight for one guy? Or is that is that the proper word to use?
I don't know. An evangelical that picks up my book probably will not find it very approving. So there is a message within it, because I deal a lot with Christian nationalism, which is we're seeing it even more now today. I was seeing it back in the 2000s and even in the 1980s and 90s, but it's evolved, and in many ways I think it's just gotten worse in terms of its impact. But that wasn't necessarily my intention to condemn everybody that's an evangelical. That's not really the point.
Right.
The point is, for me, that just didn't work for me anymore. And I'm not alone in that. The fastest growing religious group in the country right now are the quote nuns. These are people who no longer affiliate with any religious.
So N-O-N-E-S.
Yeah, N-O-N-E-S.
Yeah.
These are, so you get some thing that you fill out, and you have to check your religious belief. Well, people are checking none. They just don't affiliate with any particular religious tradition anymore, and that's probably where I would be.
Gotcha.
But it doesn't mean I've rejected the teachings of Jesus. I think they're still very, very important for us today.
Okay. Well, Dan, I thank you so much for being on Southeast Iowa today, and I look forward to having future conversations with you.
Yeah, we got a lot to talk about.
Yes, we
I got
do.
some new books coming out. So.
All right. So will you be a guest again?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, John. All right.
Definitely a thought-provoking topic and conversation, and I thank Dan Henderson for that. And we'll have Dan back on future podcast episodes. And I want to thank our sponsors: Griner Auto Body, Car Doctor, McDonald Boneyard, Girling Repair, Hinshaw Trailer Sales, B&B Propane, and the family of Jet Stops. I'm your host, John Bain. Stay friendly, Southeast Iowa.